comes down to organizational culture. And that's really where the element of psychological safety within a workplace comes in. And you don't have to be LGBTQ plus to think about psychological safety is for any person in a workspace. And it's how do you really create that space? Well, it's about the intentionality of an organizational culture, because a culture is a representation for that organization of its values, its behaviors, and the language that they use.
Hi, and welcome to Helping People Perform, the podcast that gives you fascinating insights into those people whose chosen vocation is to help others perform at their best. From consultants to teachers, sports coaches to financial advisors, all of my guests share a passion for getting the most out of individuals, teams, and organisations. Enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Helping People Perform podcast. Delighted to be joined today by award-winning diversity speaker and consultant and founding CEO at CAF Services. Welcome to the show, Cynthia Fortlage.
Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Really looking forward to this. I think there's going to be some interesting topics that we cover off, and keen to learn more about what you do right now and how you help people. But before we do that, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you to where you are today?
Absolutely. Well, believe it or not, for 30 years, I was a C-suite technology executive, but in Canada, hence the accent. I am British born, but not raised in the UK, but I have come home to the UK. So I had my corporate career there, and basically I had this major epiphany in life that we'll get to and kind of talk about, which is, part of the reason for the work that I do. And that has led me to, really focus on pivoting away from focusing on technology to really focusing on people. Because what I found was that from a technological standpoint, the technology was generic. We weren't inventing it, we were using it. So that meant for an organization, the secret sauce was people and process. And so being able to help people maximize their potential and kind of bring their whole self, their authentic self to an organization became so much more powerful for me. Unfortunately, that meant as a role of the head of technology, the fact that I no longer cared how it worked didn't exactly help. So I found that I was not aligned with that work. And in 2019, after a little over a 30-year career, I ended up pivoting completely away to do what was off the side of my desk previously, which is the work that I'm focused on today in the diversity space.
Oh, fantastic. And so if we could delve a little bit deeper into that sort of technology, what first got you into that technology side of it, and what was your journey like up to C-suite? Because I'm assuming you didn't just jump there from the start.
Really? Yeah, no, it definitely was a progressional story through there. So I started into the world of tech. This was computers were in school. Computers in school were 80-column punch cards.
Right.
People that were getting, early Apple products for the schools, or Commodore, which was a brand, in schools. That really was kind of interest to me. It also helps that for someone who's not authentically being themselves, you kind of find a way to kind of drift into the background. And that's why you find a lot of people in tech are very diverse individuals, simply because it's a great kind of career where you can kind of step away. So I ended up doing that originally with the firm that I was with. And for 8 years, I was the sole IT person. So I was kind of figuring everything out. They were going from small mini computer systems to much more major systems. About 8 years in, I became a supervisor with one individual. And, it just kind of evolved. And eventually that role, by about year 12, morphed into a full managerial role. And that took on extra responsibility, dealing with community, chambers of commerce, things like that.
Right.
And it wasn't until 1999, the big era in computing, we successfully made it through the whole bit. It took quite a bit of money to remediate all of the issues related to systems and dates and everything else. But we successfully made it through. And in that year, that's when I was made vice president, and joined the executive suite. And as we just kind of evolved, the role of vice president in the organization was very much like a CIO in other organizations. And so everybody just referred to me as a CIO. And, it just kind of evolved from there. And as I was evolving that career path, what I found was, you learn lots of lessons. We'll talk about it. I mean, the first one, when I was a supervisor, so to give you an idea of date, I learned I can't change anybody. And it's really important because that's very much a part of the work I do today. Is I'm not actually trying to change people today. I'm trying to educate and allow people to make a decision if they want to change. Whereas in that time, I was trying to change people to create a particular behavior or to get particular work done.
Yep.
And you can't make them like you.
Right.
So there's lots of lessons there. And eventually, of course, I went through other leadership development programs through my career. And that really brought a whole other set of skill sets that when I pivoted off and started working in the diversity space, I actually started doing coaching.
Right.
And I did it till 2021. And I used a lot of those executive skills in the coaching space because it was really good about helping them. I just found emotionally, I wasn't fully set up to deal with all of the emotional baggage associated with coaching. Yeah. So I've pivoted away. I've stayed with professional mentoring. I am a certified mentor, but at the end of the day, I really leave that as much more of a tertiary kind of thing I may do today. It's not what I'm really focused on. But it was just this continual evolution of realizing that all of these skills as an executive that I learned really brought it to a head when, I kind of had my 50-year epiphany, at the age of 50. And I used every one of those skills in managing myself and the journey that I was beginning at that point. That was about circa 2016. So they came full circle. And it was only at that time that I really learned the full power by using them on myself and to do that. But that also took me in many other directions in terms of, spiritual work, in terms of, people talk about self-care. Everybody would think, oh, well, self-care is I'm going to go to the nail salon, get my nails done, go get a massage. Yep. No, that's not self-care. That's pampering. It's absolutely delightful. I love to do it when I can do it. But self-care is actually doing the deep work and learning to do the really deep work inside, wrestle some of your demons and being able to transform that into something much more positive. And that's really the space that I lean in and work in today, right, is because I've been through that journey and I've dealt with, quote, the transformative effects of all of this work.
Brilliant. And I know, I've found myself guilty of this in the past in terms of the stuff that you preach as a coach, as a leader or a manager in any ways, to being able to have that ability to turn that back upon yourself in any circumstance and say, right, am I doing what I advise other people to do?
Yeah.
It's like, it's why a great coaching conversation is always about, what would you be saying to your friend or your colleague if they were in the situation? As soon as you start to put yourself in a different set of shoes and see yourself from a different angle, it really does help to open up what's the reality of what's going on right here, and what would I propose other people do, and why aren't I following that advice myself?
No, it's so true. And, even related to the work that I'm doing, when you talk about in the world of diversity, the word bias comes up. And many, many people talk about bias in a negative context, like, shame on you, you have a bias. Well, the reality is, and pretty much everybody I know admits we all have biases. I have bias, you have bias, our audience has bias. But yes, bias tells us that there's probably something that needs to change. But what a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of bias that we all carry that comes from privilege.
Right.
And so it's not like, shame on you, you've developed this bias. It just happened to be kind of the family you were born into, the way you were raised, the opportunities that that created because of the schools you went to. A lot of those are not things you had a choice about.
Hmm.
You went through and did them. Now, when you decide to go to post-secondary school or focus on a particular career, and so those are your choices based upon all the privilege you've had up to that point. And so that's when we go from, in management speak, we go from unconscious bias to conscious bias because you've now consciously made a choice to do these things. And in doing so, they create opportunity or privilege, and that privilege creates a bias because
Right.
that now becomes the filter of how you see the world. So exactly as you were saying, it's like we talk about these things, but it's how to go in. So I mean, just recently I totally turned the lens on and I wrote an article. It's on psychological safety from a human perspective. I've written one from with Chat GPT, so from an AI perspective,
Nice.
and it was very kind of step one, step two, step three, and I wrote it very much from a humanistic point of view. And the first thing I did was declare all my biases going in.
Right.
I've never done that. It was just, I'm going to talk about this, but just so you know, here's, and I think it was 6 or 7 biases that I listed. Here's 6 or 7 biases I am very aware that I have when I talk about this subject because they do influence the way I talk about it. And I wanted my audience to be aware of that. And I think that's the first time ever that I've done that with an audience and with an article
Mm.
to actually openly declare, hey, I've got these biases. So I still have lots of work to do,
Oh.
but I know how to do it.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a very powerful thing to do, and
Yeah.
I'd be intrigued. I'll make sure the link to that article's in
Okay.
the show notes. But I'm going
Yeah.
to have a read of that myself and test myself out on what are my biases
Sure.
and try to be more open on that front and declare them out where
Yeah.
necessary. So, oh, brilliant. Well, maybe that takes us nicely into what you do now. You know, with CAF services
Yeah.
and the work that you do as a speaker and consultant.
Well, I've been very blessed. As I talked a little bit about kind of the journey, started off in this coaching and so forth. Um, and again, the whole journey that took me there was because at the age of 50, with my youngest out of high school, graduating, I came to this life epiphany that I wasn't being authentic. And the authenticity was my gender.
Right.
And so I actually transitioned my gender starting in 2016. I had socially transitioned by 2017. I had medically transitioned and surgically transitioned by the end of 2018. And life's just kind of been life since that. So I really take the insights as an executive because I've also had extensive board leadership positions, as well as a board leader for a feminist organization. So to be a woman with a transgender history, that's how I prefer to refer to myself.
Yeah.
Um, and to lead a feminist organization is not a common thing.
Right.
And so it brings me an amazing insight because in Canada, nationally, here I was representing all women in Canada, leading this organization. So it actually brings a very strong feminist lens in the work that I do because I see the inequities in the world between the way men and women or the genders are treated to deal with it. So that has taken me along with that, along with the fact of now 7 years in the diversity space, both informally and formally, as well as, my extensive board leadership that I talked about, but also from the fact that I have, over 14 different boards and 2 of them as the board chair, board leader, along with it. So all of those skills have really equipped me to work in this space and be able to do the dive. So obviously it started dealing with understanding my own journey and putting language to it. And that has kind of evolved in helping others through that. So one of the early things I did, I think it's rather funny, was, and I still occasionally do it, is I hold a session primarily focused for women, but it's called 50 Years of Male Thinking in 1 hour for Women.
Right.
A little tongue in cheek, but simply what it is, when we grow up, we are socialized in our perceived identity,
Right.
how people perceive us. And what happens is if you kind of ask, well, how are women socialized versus how are men? Well, it's unwritten.
Mm.
So that means you have to start trying to decode it.
Mm.
And so what I do in these sessions is when I'm talking with women is to take the behavior. They go, my boyfriend's doing this, my husband's doing this, my coworker or boss is doing this. It helped me understand their behavior. And so I was able to start codifying it and really helping them grasp it for the purpose of helping to give that information to those women to empower them to, have the life or career that they were looking for. And that evolved into the coaching that we had talked about. And then I started working with corporations and helping corporations from a diversity perspective, not only with quote the lens of what I call one leader with two genders worth of experience as a lens that I see things, but also the fact that I have this deep history, 30 years being a tech executive, so I can look at systems and process and actually understand what things systemically are creating problems from a gender-based perspective when I look at them as well. So, doing things like that from a consultative, and I'll give you a very, very quick, simple example. I was working with a hospital in one of the NHS regions. I believe they're east of London, to give you an idea. And they're creating a brand new patient intake form. And they were trying to get the language right. And you read through it and it's got he, she, they, it's all over the place. And I went, okay. I said, so if I come in, what do you call me? They go, well, you're a patient. Okay. And I go, but if he comes in, what do you call them? Oh, well, they're a patient. So I said, why don't you just put the word patient instead of trying to worry about all of the pronouns and the whole bit? And guess what? It worked. And so that's my system thinking kicking in. And it's like, let's not overcomplicate this. And so it's like, if you're talking to a business and they talk about their clients or so forth, well, why mess around with it? Just refer to the identity, which is they're all clients. So talk about them in that sense. And that really just simplifies the complexity that we're trying to marry in. Of course, there are appropriate times that we use the detail, but somebody was asking once that, when we talk about, say, the labels associated with gender identity, I mean, the list that I use is 58. I've heard people have lists over 100. Well, first of all, I only need to remember the one associated with the person that I'm dealing with. And there's 8 million people on the planet. Or 8 billion. I don't know all 8 billion, so I don't have to remember 8 billion combinations. So guess what? It's a manageable process to learn the identity because you already do with all of your friends. You just don't think about, for instance, the pronoun element. So it's aspects like that of trying to simplify what some people perceive as very complex, and then just downright education. Like, we don't know anything. Please help us. Give us a 101. And it could be a 101 on gender, a 101 on, quote, the transgender experience in the corporate space. It could be on gender-based privilege, or most recently, as of middle of February, on psychological safety, especially related to transgender folks in a workplace where there's questions about bathrooms and change rooms and so forth. That's the article. That's kind of the big topic that I'm touching on, and really looking at all of the complex elements that make it up. It is situational, but that's kind of the conversations I really love to help organizations solve, which is why at a very broad base, if you read my profile and byline, it says I work with organizations at the intersection of sexuality, gender, privilege, and psychological safety. And that's really the space that I work in the diversity. I don't touch in a lot of areas outside of that because it's not my expertise. And I know many others who can fill in the gaps, whether it's on, the ability, disability conversation, neurodiversity, racism. So I know ageism. I know so many amazing practitioners that work in those spaces. I focus on the area that I have deep personal and professional insight to be able to help organizations.
No, and I think that's one. It's some amazing work and very much needed in certainly in the organisations that I found myself working with over the years. But not necessarily that there was overt, issues around what was being discussed. It's the fact that it wasn't being discussed. And if you then went to the C-suite, or if you went to even a management level and said, how would you cope in this situation?
Yeah.
And that people have never had that conversation before, and I think that's the really tricky piece is how how are you finding the organizations that are so there's two elements of organizations. One, there's the ones that are coming to you and having
Yeah.
those conversations. Are they scared? Are they just unsure as to what's going on? Do they, are they doing things from a legal perspective? What's the drive for them to engage with you, and how's that
Yeah.
been?
Um, yes, yes, and yes.
Right.
No, I mean it's I've had clients come to me from a legal perspective. I've clients who go, we're just trying to learn. Can you help us?
Yep.
I've got clients go, we're very advanced. We've got this right now. We're focusing on this. Can you help us fill that gap?
Right.
So yeah, so I get the whole smack, and it's right from smaller organizations who traditionally don't have dedicated staff focused on kind of the D&I,
Yep.
diversity and inclusion kind of practices, um, to the large organizations, which sometimes have an entire departments over and above the HR side of things, who actually focus on the space.
Right.
And I've worked with all of them. So I mean, I've worked with some, small, probably a handful of people kind of organizations,
Yep.
to the likes of LinkedIn and IBM and some others. So I've had a breadth, not just in the tech side, by the way, but I have that. Last year I worked with a couple of banks that I hadn't before. The season before, I was working with the travel industry and a provider in the travel space. So absolutely lots of different companies, lots of different reasons. And it's really just helping them, kind of figure it out. And now more people are kind of going, okay, you help fill a spot,
Mm.
but now that makes us go, well, how do we go on this journey? Because it ultimately, much like any organization, it comes down to organizational culture. And that's really where the element of psychological safety within a workplace comes in. And you don't have to be LGBTQ plus to think about psychological safety is for any person in a workspace. And it's how do you really create that space? Well, it's about the intentionality of an organizational culture, because a culture is a representation for that organization of its values, its behaviors, and the language that they use.
Yeah.
Right? They always say you know the health of an organization by the behavior they tolerate, the worst behavior they tolerate.
Right.
Right? And so if you find there's some absolutely egregious behavior and the organization tolerates it, well, then that's really a status of the culture of the organization. So organizations that want to create a place where everyone feels safe and wants to belong into that organization, those are the companies that I really connect with the most. And those are the ones that really value what I bring to the table.
Yeah. Brilliant stuff. Um, yeah, because I know, as I said, conversation, and we've had conversations in the past about some difficult conversations that need to be had, or when do I step in? We don't need to go too much into this, but we were in a joint situation where I felt uncomfortable with the way somebody else was talking, but
Yeah.
I wasn't sure whether or not I should be chipping in and stepping over you in that situation because you were the expert and you were the one with the lived experience.
Yeah.
But I also didn't want to say that was not call it out because it wasn't acceptable behavior in my view. So
Sure.
it's those conversations that are a tough one to have, aren't they? And they're a tough one to understand. But until we have those conversations, until we open up and think about how do we give everybody the psychological safety, everybody the same
Yeah.
opportunities to be involved in the organization, then one, it's just simply isn't fair is the first thing. But two, from a business perspective, it doesn't make sense because there are direct links between the way people are feeling due to those elements and their actual performance, which
Yeah.
leads to business performance. So
Yes.
this isn't one of a soft area. This is a
No.
direct link to bottom line as well, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And if you um, go back 5, 6 years, if you look at the work that folks were doing in the diversity space, it was very much focused on the business value was that magical 30% performance improvement, at the on the bottom line
Mm.
by having a diverse workforce. And again, the implicit aspect was, all of this idea of, intentional cultures and psychologically safe and so forth, which not many people actually experience, unfortunately. So there's still lots of work to do, which I guess is good for me. But at the end of the day, it's about people, right? And people aren't things, that they're human beings, and we all have. I always go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And the third level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is love and belonging.
Right.
We all have a psychological need to belong.
Mm.
So we want to belong in societies. We want to belong, within our work organizations. So, i.e., within the societies, the cultures of the organization. We just want to belong.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to quote, and overrule somebody else, and especially when you are of a marginalized identity. And there is actually a hierarchy of privilege, which really talks to this idea of based upon different identities within different income brackets or socioeconomic status, you can actually kind of pinpoint where it is. So believe it or not, as a white woman with a transgender history, so LGBTQ plus, I'm 2/3 of the way down that privilege scale.
Wow.
Yet at the very bottom of it is a woman of color who's LGBTQ plus is at the bottom of that privilege chain.
Wow.
So, I mean, even on the bottom, I can still carry a lot of privilege to help uplift those who are below me.
Yeah.
But at the very top are, white, male, um, typically identifying as straight,
Yep.
or heterosexual, and they're at the top of the food chain in terms of that hierarchy. White women, cisgender women, are second on the list. So again, when we talk about it, there's this huge disparity between, because there's lots of other identities that fall within there that, are defined. So when we look at all of this and kind of keep in mind what Maslow says, realize that the more you kind of are down that scale, you're also lower on Maslow's scale to a large degree, because you go from, of course, the very first level of Maslow's, we're fighting for survival. And so it's a fight or flight response to everything that happens. And so you got to realize that people who don't carry the power and privilege that you do may be at that level, and they're actually thinking in a fight or flight mode. Right. So you go, well, just why is everything so aggressive? Because they're fighting for their existence. The next level is, where, people start to actually, I just relabeled it in the work that I do. You're existing, right? You're not fighting for survival. You've got housing, you probably have some form of income and so forth. You're existing in society, but you're not contributing. And that's where the next level, that's where the magic happens. That's where you start to unlock somebody's full potential, because you start to get them in a place where they feel like they belong. They can bring their full authentic self to work. Now, I mean, everybody throws that word around. And just to clarify, I'm not talking about just LGBTQ plus people here. Every one of us does not bring our full authentic self to work. We're always hiding, putting something behind. We have, quote, a work face. I've talked to some women that say that, when they get ready in the morning, they, quote, put on their armor to walk into the corporate world. Whatever it is, we're not allowed to be authentic. It doesn't matter who you are. And so the ideas that I'm talking about is, I want everyone to feel safe so they can all be authentic, and we can all kind of take down our guard a little bit and actually interact in human being. And that doesn't mean we agree, but it means we can interact.
Oh, wonderful. And we can talk about this for hours, I'm sure. And just one of the other bits that came to mind in one of the previous conversations that we had as well, we talked about that element of pale, male, and stale. And my personal reflection is, I am pale, I am male, but I choose not.
You're
to
not
do,
stale,
but I choose not to do anything about those two things. But I'm choosing that it's the stale bit that I can manage.
Yeah.
And I think it's when people talk about almost in a negative way of, oh, I'm being discriminated against because I'm pale, male, and stale. Well, being pale and male first of all puts you very top of that privilege
Yes.
list, and you don't have to be stale. You know,
No.
you can choose to change
Yeah.
your behaviors and listen more and have these conversations and just
Yeah.
bring yourself to work, but allow others to bring their authentic self as well, isn't
Absolutely. And, Paul, think of it this way. So you're pale. It's the way you were born. You can't change that,
it? Yeah,
just as everyone else. So that, right? So yeah, they're definitely bias.
yeah,
As you said, it's in there. You can work on that because you're not stale, right? You're male. Imagine the privilege it is to actually agree with the identity that you were given at birth based upon a physical part of your body.
yeah,
And to not, because they can't see into your body, nor do you have language, of course, when you're born. So you
right.
can't tell them who you are. So that is a privilege. And a
Mm.
lot of people don't think of it that way is,
Mm.
guess what? Actually knowing you go, well, I'm male. Yep, I agree with that. What a privilege
Yeah,
to deal with it. And as you already talked about the stale piece. So again, those pieces are something, both of them, you really had no control over. It's just thankful for the second one. You do agree.
mm.
And that's what actually gives you privilege is the fact that you agree, not the fact that that's how you were born.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant stuff. Maybe let's focus on something slightly different, which is about how you help yourself perform. You know, who
Yes.
do you go to? What do you do to help you be the best you in the work that you do?
Absolutely. Well, there's quite a few things. So rattle through them very quickly. Number one is very spiritual. So I combine a number of different practices. I use as many of them as I possibly can, all the way from quote, what would be described as some new age, crystal energy work, light and sound work, to, dealing with indigenous cultures and smudging as a way to quote, cleanse my soul,
Mm.
to do that into, very ancient, Eastern practices of meditation and so forth, and allowing me to really go in to deal with it, along with some, breath work into that to really get me, quote, zoned in and just kind of live in that space, doing the deep work. So that's some of the aspects. Of course, having, a good group of friends. It's not measured in quantity, it's in quality.
Yeah.
So I have less than a handful of key friends that I can talk through things that are in my head and what's going on. I do have a mental health professional, and one of my friends is a professional coach, and we've agreed she's not my official coach, but she seems to be coaching me a lot these days. And I gladly take all of the guidance and advice, and reflecting on the work that needs to be done, because sometimes it's the obvious, you just don't see yourself,
Yeah.
and somebody has to point at you, go, of course.
Yeah.
So lots of different techniques that I'm doing in order to bring my best self. Honestly, I need 2 down days a week, and not just necessarily the weekend,
Mm.
because it just takes such a toll to really take on and help people from really what is a heart-centered
Mm.
role.
Oh, some wonderful stuff there, and
Yeah.
you know, one of the things that word that I've noted down here is around reflection. You know, whether it's breath work, whether it's yoga, whatever it is for you,
Yeah.
that it's that element of reflection and looking inwards. Firstly, to understand your true self, and then secondly, to get yourself in that zone of how am I going to operate and bring my full self to
Yeah.
the work that I've got in front of me right now. Oh, wonderful.
Absolutely.
So maybe a couple of slightly different questions then, in
Yeah.
terms of if you had the opportunity to work with any individual team or organization with the skill set that you've got,
Yeah.
who would you want that to be?
Oh gosh. I mean, love a lot of the folks that I'm doing. I mean, to me, there's just so many organizations, groups that need the work. Certainly in the UK specifically, the government. Oh my gosh, they need a lot of this work. I don't know that I'm up for changing the whole government, but I would certainly love a shot to work with the leadership community in business that impact or influence government, but also the leaders in government that influence policy
Right.
in order to help drive some education and change.
Yeah. Ah, no small feat then. Cool.
No.
And similarly, if you were able to sit down and have a coffee, have a drink, have a meal with somebody to learn from them to help
Yeah.
your own performance, who would you want that to be?
My mom.
Right.
She's been gone half a dozen years.
Hmm.
Um, it's odd. It's not until she was gone and a number of years have passed that I realized I just took her for granted. Like,
Right.
she was always there in my life. Um, when I think of things and I think back on them, it was always there. And I would just love an opportunity to sit down and reflect on everything where I'm at with my mom and hear kind of her insights and what she has to offer. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't, quote, woke.
Right.
But you know what? She was working at it. And I would just love an opportunity to do that again.
Oh, wonderful. So, just to close out, then,
Yeah.
how do people find out more? How do people get in touch and find out more about the great work you're doing?
Well, thank you. It's they can obviously on my website at www.cynthiafortlage.com.
Yep.
And that's CYNTHIAFORTLAGE.com.
Yep.
You can also find me on Instagram or TikTok at CAF Services, all one word. And of course, through LinkedIn, which is my preferred business networking site, and being able to connect through there. I am on lots of other, I still have what I call a tertiary presence on Twitter. I have a tertiary presence on Facebook,
Yeah.
but those are not really where I'm looking to connect with audiences and to build. I'm really looking to do it. Things like LinkedIn, Instagram, and TikTok.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. I'm doing the same at the moment as well, focusing on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Yeah.
I haven't not down with the kids yet to get into the tickety tocky, but I'll get there at some point, I'm sure. Cynthia, it's been a fascinating conversation and really enjoyed chatting with you about this today, and love the work that you're doing to help organisations and help people perform at their best. So thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, then please give the podcast a rate, review and share. I'm Paul Teasdale, and from sausage making to banking, oil and gas to Formula One, I help people perform. If you'd like to find out more and have a conversation, contact me via helpingpeopleperform.com.